My name's Will, and I live in the suburbs with my parents. We're not too far from a city, but we're also not too far from some rural country roads. My friends and I would spend many days biking around and checking things out. We never had any trouble finding our way home, because there were really just a few main roads, and smaller ones branching off of them. As soon as you made it to one of the larger roads, you could always find your way back. One sunny day, my friends John, Garrett, and I set out on our bikes. We had been to most places around there by this time, but we went further than we ever have before. As we continued our ride, our eyes caught sight of a house that stood alone on the side of the road. Its dilapidated appearance and overgrown weeds made us think it was abandoned. The barren fields next to it were further proof. We were curious, so we decided to check it out. We left our bikes by the roadside and approached the desolate house with cautious steps. The weeds were too overgrown to ride through. As we got closer, we could tell the place was an absolute death trap. Garrett wanted to go in. He had always been the most reckless of us, but John and I refused to allow it. Garrett backed down quickly, as if he knew it was a dumb idea deep down. The place was falling apart. It seemed that simply pushing the door open would run the risk of knocking the whole place down. The windows were all missing, not broken. There was no glass at all, and the roof was missing at least half of its shingles. Although we had decided not to go in, we were still curious. We thought we could at least peek inside. Garrett, always being the boldest among us, walked up to one of the empty window frames and poked his head in. John and I watched from a distance. As soon as Garrett looked in, he turned around and ran back, his face white as a ghost. Then he threw up on the ground. John and I were speechless. I asked him what he saw. In a trembling voice, he told us that there was a dead body in there. The words hung in the air. None of us knew what to say. Garrett was the most daring of us, but he wasn't a liar, and he wasn't any kind of prankster. John and I believed him right away. Neither of us went up to the window to confirm, though. We pedaled as fast as we could, determined to get home and tell what Garrett had seen. The sun was starting to go down, and our shadows were long on the road. I burst into my house and told my parents everything. For a moment, they seemed skeptical, but they called the cops anyway. As soon as we described the house, the officer knew what we were talking about. Apparently, it was well known to them because criminals and drug dealers would use it as a meeting place. I was just surprised that anybody actually went in there. Maybe it was a little more solid than we thought. When the police went to investigate, they found the body of a man. He was so decomposed that they weren't able to identify him or determine a cause of death. Days turned into weeks as the investigation unfolded, but the identity of the deceased man remained unknown. The discovery of that body sent a shockwave through our community, leaving us all on edge. Speculations and theories swirled, but the truth remained a mystery. Life eventually returned to normal, but the memory of that fateful day lingered in our minds. The house stood as a haunting reminder of what we found. I thought they should tear it down, but it wasn't up to me. The house still stands there, in that spot, to this day. I'm Alex, and my wife Kara and I recently rented a house in a nice neighborhood. Little did we know that a story like this would come out of it. The place was a single-story house on a corner lot. It was smaller than we wanted. There was no garage and only space for one car on the driveway. One of us had to park on the street because of that. We knew that we would have to upgrade at some point, but it was good for the time being. It had a suburban feel, but it was still not far from a major bus route, so it wasn't all bad. We moved in the first weekend of June of last year. The landlord met us there and gave us the keys, and he even helped us with some boxes. He was an awkward guy, probably around 10 years older than me, maybe a little more. I was 29 at the time, so I'd say he was probably in his early 40s. He was really quiet, uncomfortably quiet. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm an introvert, so I get it, but this guy took it to another level. He was slightly overweight, with long black hair and glasses. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt every time I saw him. We stayed there for the first few weeks, and nothing went wrong. But one Sunday morning over breakfast, Kara mentioned that she had heard strange noises during the night. I was surprised, because I never heard anything, and I tend to be a light sleeper. We discussed the possibilities. I was hoping it was nothing, but she was pretty sure that somebody was in the house. Even though I didn't hear it, I took her word for it. Determined to put our minds at ease, I had decided to discuss the matter with our landlord Carl. I reached out to him and told him what we wanted to do. I suggested that we install security cameras in the house. It seemed like the easiest way to get to the bottom of it. To my surprise, Carl flatly refused. He said it would cause damage to the house. I thought that explanation made no sense. What difference does a few screw holes make? The house was not exactly new either. It was in decent shape, but it wasn't a palace. I didn't think he would even notice if we did it. I just asked in order to be courteous. I decided then that I didn't need his permission anyway. I could patch up any holes left by the cameras when we moved out. Worst case scenario was that we would lose our damaged deposit, and I could live with that. After consulting with Kara, I took matters into my own hands. We were on the same page. I researched various security systems, and despite our landlord's disapproval, I proceeded to install them discreetly throughout our home. Nothing came up for the first few days. I checked the footage every morning, but there was nothing there. We were starting to think it was all in our heads, because nothing was even stolen the night when Kara heard noises. One morning, though, Kara and I woke up. Neither of us heard anything that night, but I decided to check the camera footage on my phone anyway. What I saw on the screen made my blood run cold. There in the dimly lit hallway was Carl, the landlord. He moved down the hall, his gaze fixated on our bedroom. As he moved closer, I changed to a different camera. He poked his ugly head into our room and stood there for almost 20 minutes. I had to fast forward the video. It was so disturbing. Shock and anger hit us both as we watched. We called the police right after, and Carl was arrested on a variety of charges. We had to move out of the house after that happened, because it was a crime scene. We stayed at an Airbnb for a while, until we found a new place. Later, we found out that Carl had hidden cameras throughout the house as well. It was all used as evidence for what he did. In the end, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for what he did to us and other tenants of that house. We never saw him again, and I hope that never changes. Before I got married, I lived alone in a small house. It was a single-story, 2-bedroom place that was detached. It had a decent backyard too. It was more than enough space for me, but I was doing pretty well at work back then, so I could afford it. Not that it was crazy expensive or anything, just more than I needed. One night, after a long day at work, I came home later than usual. It was around 10 p.m. I pulled my car into the driveway and walked up to the front door. As I walked in, exhaustion weighed heavily on me. It had been a really long day, and I was ready to go straight to bed. When I entered my house and flicked on the light switch, I was stunned at what I'd seen. I stumbled upon a scene of complete chaos. My belongings were strewn across the floor, and it was evident that somebody had broken in. I stood there in shock for a few seconds, and then I heard loud footsteps from the other room. I almost panicked, because it seemed that the intruders were still in the house. I figured that if I heard them, then they must have heard me. Just then, I heard my bedroom door slam shut. I knew they must be in there. I was somewhat relieved that they didn't come for me. Without hesitation, I retreated silently. I backed out the front door and got back into my car. I was somewhat relieved that I never came face to face with them. Who knows what they might have done if I did. I started my car, and then I drove down the street. On my way, I noticed a black Ford pickup truck that seemed out of place. It was an older model, with only the 2 front seats and an open back. I knew all of my neighbors, and it was rare to see an unfamiliar car. I thought it might belong to the robbers. I wasn't smart enough to take down the license plate, though. I parked on the side of the street a few blocks away and dialed 911. The pickup truck was still in my rearview mirror. I explained the situation to the operator. I was stumbling over my words. I sat there waiting for a few minutes, and then suddenly, the pickup truck came to life. Its headlights soared past me as I was sitting there waiting. Not more than a minute later, the police arrived. They carefully searched the house, but there was nobody there. That's when I told them about the truck. The police put out a search based on my description. I stayed at a hotel that night and missed work the next day. It was a pretty traumatic experience. Some of my stuff was missing, but I didn't have a lot of expensive things. The only thing that really bothered me was that they stole a watch that was a gift from my grandfather. It wasn't even that valuable. It was just sentimental value. Other than that, it was just a couple $100s in cash. There was also a broken window where they entered. The police did catch the burglars a few days later, and my stuff was thankfully recovered. I was pretty shaken up by what happened, and it was a few months before I felt comfortable in my home again. I installed some cameras and a security system afterwards. Back in the mid-80s, I lived in a row house with my ex-wife, my young son, and my stepson. We also had a boarder living with us named Alan Bradley, a nice man, one of the kindest men I've yet to meet. Living in this row house was a very surreal and dark experience, like something was living there that thrived on bad emotions, anger, and sadness, the usual prerequisites for living in a haunted house. But this place was different. I've been in haunted houses before and since, but nothing like this evil place. One time, I asked Alan why he slept with the lights on in the basement. The man was in his late 40s, maybe 50s. The poor man was so embarrassed to tell me, but explained that he was scared to sleep in the dark because of the man who watched him from the shadows, and I believed him. It was just an evil place. He would hear things moving upstairs, or in the kitchen, and then walk in, and there was no one there. Not so scary, but just different, like something lived there that was not quite human, or had ever been human. One night, I was going to work on the midnight shift. It was dark and snowing, a typical Toronto November evening. As I was walking down the street, the snow was falling, and I was just lost in thought, like any 23-year-old with far too much responsibility on his shoulders. By this age, unlike most guys, I had already been in the Canadian military. I'd been to 6 countries on my own, and traveled along the East German border. I saw endless miles of barbed wire electrified fence, miles of landmines forever stretching along the horizon. I was married with a son and a unionized job, so again, I was not your typical 23-year-old. As I was walking, this man up the street came around the corner, but fast, almost robotic-like. I can still remember it like it was yesterday. The guy was in his late 40s, wearing a gray trench coat with a rope wrapped around the middle. The guy was very skinny, almost bone-like, wearing glasses. He then just started walking towards me fast. Again, I'm a veteran, so I can handle myself, but this guy passed towards me so fast, and when he passed me, he looked at me with this evil, sinister smile. Then I felt the blow, like the coldest piece of ice you could ever imagine, going deep into my chest, but he had never touched me physically. I remember dropping to one knee and grasping for breath. I was beyond cold. I just can't explain it. Even to this day, when I become threatened, which is not very often, I can feel this cold in my chest that's as powerful as it was back then. I turned around to look at the man, and he was gone into thin air. No footprints, nothing. He just disappeared. Years later, and I'm divorced with my son, and I decided to call the Warrens to ask for their thoughts. For those who don't know, Ed and Lorraine Warren were paranormal investigators. In those days, they actually had a listed phone number, with Ed picking up first and Lorraine listening on the other line. I explained briefly, far more briefly than this story, because Ed asked me to be brief. After about 10 minutes, Ed told me that I was not crazy and that I had encountered a demon. A jealous demon that lived in the house or on that land and had never been human. And that was it. No Exorcist kind of drama. Just an encounter with one hell of a jealous demon. Ed explained that it was jealous that I was young and alive and that it had never been. When I was moving out of the house, I explained to the new neighbors, a couple of gay dudes, that the house was haunted. Of course they rolled their eyes, yet as a woman down the street had informed me, they moved out 4 months later in the middle of the night, without any explanation. To this day, this story remains one of the 2 scariest encounters I've ever had with demons. I'm a proud member of the Métis Indigenous Mi'kmaq people of northern New Brunswick, Canada. Are these things real? Yes, they are, my friends.